Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive
Today we are tackling something.
that you encounter all the time but probably don't overthink, which is tests.
Okay.
Specifically, how do we know if a test actually measures what it claims to?
That's a question with huge GE implications. Think about it. Job offers, school placements, even medical diagnoses can hinge on test scores.
Right.
Inaccurate tests can have a real ripple effect.
Exactly. Imagine getting passed over for a job because of a personality test. That wasn't quite right.
Now, yeah.
Our guide today is Chapter 7 of Applied Psychology in Talent Management.
And it kicks off with a real head scratcher about a police department study.
Yes. This study is a perfect example of getting reliable results, but those results being wrong.
Oh,
They found that officers should be paid more than detectives. Now,
that-
anybody who's seen, a cop show on TV knows that's usually not the case.
right. Yeah. So it's like your bathroom scale consistently saying that you weigh like 10 pounds less than you actually do. Sure, it's reliable,
Right.
but definitely not valid.
Exactly.
We need both, right? How do we make sure that we're on the right track?
That's where validity swoops in to save the day. The chapter uses this awesome analogy of a detective's toolkit. We need different types of evidence to be confident in a test.
Okay.
So let's unpack this toolkit a little bit. First up, content-related evidence. Okay,
Oh.
so what's the gist?
Imagine you're designing a test for firefighters.
Yeah.
You wouldn't just test them on fire safety rigs, right?
Right,
You'd want to see them handle a fire hose under pressure.
right.
It's about making sure the test kind of reflects the real deal.
Actions speak louder than words.
Yes.
The chapter dives into how this works with something called a minimum qualifications test.
Yeah.
Like when you're applying for a job, for example, they go through a whole 8-step process
Yes.
for validating these tests.
And what's fascinating is how much emphasis is placed on real-world application.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just theoretical. These tests can have legal consequences, so the stakes are high.
Wow, so content validity is all about making sure we're testing the right stuff. But then there's also this idea of criterion-related evidence,
Yes.
which sounds very future predicting.
It does, doesn't it?
you
But
know.
really, it's about how well test scores line up with real-world outcomes.
Okay.
Think of it like those personality tests you take when applying for jobs.
Wait, are you saying those tests are trying to predict how well I'd do at the job? I always thought those were more about, like, weeding out the weirdos.
Yeah, hopefully not.
But yes, that's exactly what they're trying to do. They're looking for patterns between your personality and your potential job performance.
That's predictive validity in action.
Wow, I've never thought of it that way. That's really interesting. It's like they're trying to peek into my future.
In a way, yes. But remember, it's not about fortune-telling. It's about using data to make informed guesses.
Makes sense.
Hmm.
So how do researchers figure that out? Do they just follow people around for years?
That would make for some interesting reality TV. But luckily, there are more practical ways to study this. They're called predictive studies.
Okay.
Think of the NFL Combine. They put these athletes through the ringer with drills like the 40-yard
Yeah.
dash to see if their performance can predict their success in the NFL.
Ah, so it's like a sneak peek into their potential future performance.
Yes.
Makes sense. But what about those concurrent studies you mentioned earlier? How are those different?
Think of a concurrent study like taking a snapshot in time.
Okay.
Instead of waiting to see what happens in the future, you look at what's going on right now.
Okay, so it's like comparing the test scores of current salespeople to their current sales figures.
Exactly. But this approach has its limitations.
Yeah.
Let's say you're testing the situational judgment of experienced police officers.
Okay.
Their years on the street might make them react differently to hypothetical scenarios than a rookie fresh out of the academy.
Ah, so experience can be a bit of a wild card.
Precisely.
And that highlights how important context is in all of this. You can't assume a test will be equally valid in all situations.
So we've got content validity, checking if we're testing the right stuff, and criterion-related validity, which is all about predicting future behavior.
Oh.
What's the third tool in our detective's kit?
That would be construct-related evidence.
Thank you.
And this one gets a little more abstract. It's about figuring out what a test really measures at its core. We're digging into the underlying theory here.
Intriguing. I'm all about uncovering hidden depths.
Yes.
It's like that saying, like, iceberg ahead, only 10% showing.
I love that analogy. And the chapter actually uses a study on Navy recruiters to illustrate this perfectly.
Okay.
They weren't just looking at how many recruits these folks brought in, but the underlying traits that made them successful.
So, like, were they trying to pinpoint those invisible qualities like charisma or persuasion
Yes,
skills
exactly.
that might predict success in that specific role?
Exactly. They used a statistical technique called factor analysis, which is like a detective tool for finding hidden patterns in data.
Sounds fancy. And this is where the science behind it all kind of shines through, right?
Yes,
It's not just gut feeling, but data-driven insights.
precisely. And what they found was pretty cool. By understanding these underlying constructs, they could actually make their selection process even more accurate.
That's incredible. It's like cracking the code for hiring the right people.
Yeah.
But before we get too carried away, are there things that can kind of throw off these validity results? Like, are there wrenches we can throw into this well-oiled machine?
Absolutely. It's like a detective dealing with misleading clues. One big one is something called range restriction.
Okay, break that down for me.
Imagine you're trying to validate a test for astronaut training.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone applying is already going to be at the top of their game, right?
Right.
There's not much variation in their abilities.
So it's like trying to judge like a Michelin star restaurant based on reviews from people who only eat at the best places anyway.
Yeah.
It doesn't tell you how the average person would feel.
A perfect analogy. That limited range of scores can make a test appear more or less valid than it actually is.
So we need to be mindful of who we're testing and what we're trying to measure.
Context is key.
Absolutely.
Another thing to keep in mind is that the relationship between test scores and the outcome we're predicting isn't always a straight line.
You mean it's not always as simple as higher score equals better performance?
Sometimes it's more complex than that. We might have a curved relationship where the test is a good predictor at some score levels, but not others.
So it's like assuming that a map of the world is flat when it's actually round. Right?
Yes,
You're bound to run into some issues if you try to navigate that way.
exactly.
And speaking of navigating new territory,
Yes.
we've talked about testing the right things and predicting future behavior.
Right.
But what happens when we take our trustee test and try it out with a new group of people?
Okay.
That's when we get into the fascinating world of cross-validation, seeing if our test can travel from one group to another and still hold up.
Okay.
It's like checking if a recipe that's a hit in your family still wows at a potluck.
So it's like putting our test to the ultimate test.
Right.
Making sure it's not just a one-hit wonder.
Exactly. And there are a couple of ways we can do this.
Okay.
Empirical cross-validation is like taking the test on a road trip.
Okay.
We apply what we learned from our initial group and see if it works with a completely new bunch.
So it's like field testing our test in a different environment.
Precisely.
Okay.
It's the gold standard, but it can be a bit resource intensive.
Okay.
You need a lot of data and oftentimes a lot of time.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So are there any shortcuts if you don't have unlimited resources? Asking for a friend, of course.
Well, that's where statistical cross-validation comes in.
Okay.
Instead of gathering a whole new data set, we use formulas to adjust our initial findings
Okay.
based on things like the sample size,
Yeah.
essentially mimicking a new sample mathematically.
Yeah. So instead of going on that cross-country road trip, we're using a map and compass to get a sense of the lay of the land.
That's a great way to put it.
And research suggests that with a decent sample size to begin with,
Uh-huh.
this approach can be quite accurate.
That's good news for those of us who don't have a team of statisticians on speed dial. But what if even a slightly stripped-down validation study just isn't feasible?
That's a really important question. And thankfully, the chapter throws us a few lifelines.
Okay.
It talks about synthetic validity, test transportability, and validity generalization.
Okay.
Think of these as clever workarounds when a full-blown study just isn't in the cards.
So it's like finding those clever shortcuts that help you win at a board game.
Exactly. And of those three, I think validity generalization is particularly interesting.
Okay.
Instead of always starting from scratch,
Uh-huh.
it leverages existing research.
So instead of doing one small study that might not give us the full picture, we could look at a bunch of studies already done on the same topic.
Exactly. We pull together those findings from multiple studies
Okay.
to see if a test consistently hits the mark. It's like having a panel of experts weigh in,
Okay.
instead of relying on a single opinion.
Makes sense, especially when decisions based on these tests have like real-world consequences. The chapter uses an example of 5 studies looking at the same test and how researchers can tell if the test's accuracy, its validity, holds up across the board. It's like making sure a song sounds good no matter what. You play it on your phone speaker,
Huh.
a fancy stereo, or even those old school boom boxes.
I love that analogy.
And it highlights something crucial about validity generalization. It's not just about slapping a good or bad label on a test.
Okay.
It helps us understand when and where a test is likely to be most accurate,
Right.
and what factors might make it less so.
So it's like realizing that even the best GPS isn't much help if you're lost in the wilderness without cell service.
Yes.
Context is still king.
Precisely. Validity generalization studies often look for moderators, factors that can explain why a test might be more accurate in some situations than others. So, say I'm a hiring manager
Okay.
at a small company, and I can't run my own fancy validation study. Can I just pick a test with good validity generalization and call it a day?
That's where things get a little tricky. While validity generalization is powerful, it's not a free pass to use any test willy-nilly.
Right.
So just because a test has a seal of approval from a meta-analysis, which combines lots of studies,
Right.
doesn't mean it's a perfect fit for my company or the specific job I'm hiring for.
Exactly. Due diligence is still key.
Okay.
You'll need to make sure that the test actually measures skills relevant to the job and is a good fit for your company culture and the candidates you want to attract. It's like finding a pair of shoes that look amazing,
Right.
but end up giving you blisters because they don't quite fit right.
Yes.
Style over substance only gets you so far.
That's a fantastic way to put it. Using a test responsibly means going beyond just a single number,
Yes.
even if it seems impressive. It's about understanding the nuances of the research,
Right.
the potential limitations, and using all of that information to make informed decisions.
And this is where the human element, the art of talent management, really comes into play. It's not just about crunching numbers. It's about using our judgment and expertise to make the best choices for our organizations and the people in them.
Absolutely. And speaking of making informed choices, we've talked about the importance of context and due diligence, but with all this talk about meta-analysis and mountains of research, it's easy to get caught up in the numbers. How do we make sure we're not just blindly trusting a study because it sounds impressive?
That's where critical thinking comes in. Just because a study has meta-analysis in the title doesn't mean it's the be-all and end-all.
Right.
There are a lot of judgment calls that go into those studies,
right.
and those choices can definitely influence the results.
So it's like anything else. We need to be savvy consumers of information. Don't just grab the shiniest object on the shelf. Take a closer look.
Exactly. And the chapter does a great job of highlighting some of those potential pitfalls.
Okay.
For example, one thing to watch out for is making sure we're comparing apples to apples when looking at validity coefficients from different studies.
Right, like it wouldn't make much sense to compare the validity of a typing test for administrative assistants to the validity of a surgical skills test for brain surgeons, right?
Absolutely. We also have to be aware of something called the file drawer problem,
Okay.
which sounds a bit ominous.
Okay, now you've got me intrigued. What's lurking in the file drawer?
Well, it's this idea that studies with really clear, exciting findings, what we call statistically significant results, are more likely to get published.
Okay.
Those that don't find anything groundbreaking might end up hidden away in a file drawer somewhere.
Ah, so it's like only reading the glowing 5-star reviews online and ignoring those less than stellar experiences that people didn't bother to share.
A perfect analogy.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of skewed views, we can't forget that just because a test works well for a certain group in general doesn't mean it's going to be equally valid for every single person within that group.
Right, people are more than just like walking data points. We
Right.
don't all fit into neat little boxes.
Exactly. And that's where those moderators we talked about earlier come back into play.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to consider the factors that might make a test more or less accurate for different people within a larger group.
So, for example, maybe a certain personality trait influences how well a test predicts job performance, or maybe company culture plays a role, right?
Yes.
It's all about looking for those nuances.
Precisely. And what's really cool is that there are statistical techniques that allow us to actually test for these moderators.
Okay.
We're not just speculating. We're using data to figure out when and for whom a test is likely to be most accurate.
Wow, that's incredibly powerful. So it sounds like understanding validity isn't about finding a simple yes or no answer.
You hit the nail on the head. It's more like a spectrum, and our job is to figure out where a particular test falls on that spectrum and what factors might be influencing its position. And that takes careful analysis, critical thinking, and a healthy dose of skepticism.
And maybe a bit of humility too, right? Because even with the best intentions and all the fancy statistical tools in the world, we're always going to be dealing with some level of uncertainty when we're trying to measure something as complex as, human qualities.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, on that note of embracing complexity and recognizing the limits of measurement, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive for today.
Time flies when you're exploring the fascinating world of validity.
It really does. So to wrap things up, I have a question for you listening out there. If you were designing a test, what would be your biggest challenge in making sure it was both reliable and valid? And how do you think inaccurate tests could impact your life? Think about it. Until next time, keep diving deep, and we'll see you on the next episode of The Deep Dive.